Alright, class, today we're still in chapter 11. We had started talking about the growth math last time, but we did not quite finish it, so let's go through that. So our main measure of the economic well-being here is real GDP per capita, that is per person. We said last time, well, correct also, not just for population growth, but also for inflation. The big example there was China. They have lots of people and lots of workers, very high GDP. GDP per person, though, is still pretty modest because that large GDP is spread across an enormous population. So I'm going to use GRPC for the growth rate of real GDP per capita. GPOP was population growth. The other symbols we know from Chapter 6, GR is the growth rate of real GDP, G is the growth rate of nominal GDP, pi is inflation. So we have this approximation we talked about last time in class, where the growth rate of real GDP per capita is roughly the growth rate of nominal minus inflation minus population growth. So at the very end of the previous class, we started talking about the exact formula for real GDP per capita growth. Unfortunately, your book skips it, but it's important to know. So the exact formula is that 1 plus the growth rate of real GDP per capita is 1 plus the growth rate of nominal, divided by 1 plus inflation times 1 plus GPOP. And we go through this example last time where we saw that the approximation is pretty good for small numbers, really off by 0.03%. What we were running out of time for was what happens when you have bigger numbers. Then the quality of approximation deteriorates. So here's an example. Go ahead and pause the video to work out what happens. So we're having 40% nominal GDP growth over a long period of time. Then we have prices doubling. That means 100% inflation. GPOP's also going to be 100%. So go ahead and pause the video and work out what is the approximate and what is the exact growth rate of real GDP per capita. Did you solve it? So with our approximation, the growth rate would be 200%. So that comes from that nominal growth rate of 100% minus 100% inflation minus 100% population growth. There's 200 for you. Or 200%, not 200, but 200% for you. Now the exact formula, we had 1 plus GRPC over there. So to get just plain GRPC, I got to subtract 1 from both sides. Now, as a reminder, this is an issue back on the midterm. 400% does not mean you're plugging 1 plus 400 up there. It means you're plugging 1 plus 4. Likewise, pi being 100% does not mean you plug in 1 plus 100. It means you plug in 1 plus 1. So you do that, you get a GRPC is going to be 5 over 4 minus 1. That comes out to 1/4. We all know 1/4 is 25%. So the approximation is really bad when you have big numbers. The actual growth rate is 25%. Approximation was off by more than 100%. Not good. So bear in mind you have large numbers involved, use the exact one. Now, a common question is, how large is large enough that you start using the exact one? I don't have an exact cutoff, but whenever you're unsure, go exact. I don't penalize precision. All right, those are our formulas for the growth rates of real GDP per capita. Now, one important thing to realize when you're dealing with long-run growth is the power of compounding. So my illustration here I'm going to have two countries. One of them has a 3% growth rate. The other one has a 2.7% growth rate. You might be thinking, well, it's only different by 0.3%. 0.3% is pretty small, so this shouldn't really matter a whole lot. Now, because of compounding, it's actually can matter quite a bit over the long term. So for a while, you see these countries are pretty identical almost in their real GDP per capita. But over time, that compounding gets a larger and larger effect, and these curves really diverge. By the end of our simulation, the gap is around, looks like roughly $50,000 per person. So that's a lot. How that gap gets so wide? Well, at first, we get 3% versus 2.7% of the same number, $10,000. The further out you go, now having a bigger percent, bigger 3% times a bigger and bigger number versus 2.7% of a relatively smaller and smaller number. So that's why it widens over time. So you can see that even a very small increase in the growth rate can have huge implications for well-being down the road. So if we find a way to even modestly increase the U.S. growth rate, that would be a pretty big deal. Here are some more illustrations of compounding. Now, be a little bit careful here. With both these examples, there is a very intuitive answer that is wrong, so think carefully before you answer. First question for you guys. If real GDP per capita is $100, that grows at 10% per year, how much is it in 2 years? Go ahead and pause the video and think about that question and get an answer before you continue. So the trap is saying $120, so hopefully you did not answer that. So how you think that would be 10% of 100 is 10. So we get $10 more per year. $10 more per year times 2 years is $20, so it goes 120. That's actually wrong. Here's how you want to actually think about it. So in the first year, yeah, we do get $10 because 10% of 100 is 10. Now in the second year, we're getting 10% of 110, not 10% of 100. And 10% of 110 is 11. 110 plus 11 is 121, so actually we get $121, not 120. What's going on there is you're not just getting growth in that original $100, you're getting growth on top of the previous growth. That's why you got 121, not 120. So our second question, also as a trap, let's say x is growing at a rate of 50% per year. About how long does it take to double? The intuitively appealing answer is 2 years. That's not true. Here's how you could fall for the trap. You might think 50% is half, 2 halves is a whole, so it's going to take 2 years exactly. But that neglects compounding. So in the first year you have 1.5 times x. In the second year, you get 1.5 times the 1.5 times x. 50% growth on top of the previous 50% growth. So in 2 years, you'll get 2 times x. You get 2.25 times x. So if in 2 years we get more than double, that means it's going to exactly double in under 2 years. So the example is basically tell you to not ignore compounding. So be careful when you're thinking about growth over time to include compounding. So I did not give you a precise answer to that last question about when is X going to double if it's growing at 50% per year. We can get an answer using something called the Rule of 70. Now, Rule of 70 applies when you have constant growth rates. You might think, well, in real life, aren't growth rates variable? In many cases, there are growth rates that are approximately constant. Things like the growth rate of population in the U.S. is roughly constant, for example. Also, in some theoretical models, the long-run trend growth rate is constant. The fluctuations around it, of course, are variables, but the trend itself can be a constant. So the Rule of 70 tells us if a variable is growing at a constant rate of n% per year, it's going to double in roughly 70 divided by n years. So now let's go back and answer that previous question. If x grows at a rate of 50% per year, about when is it going to double? So you plug in 50 for n, and you get 70 divided by 50, which is 7 over 5. 7 over 5 is 14 over 10, so you get 1.4 years, approximately. Now, this approximation has a different property than the other one we saw at the beginning of this video. This one actually works fairly well even with large numbers. So I won't go through the exact formula here because that's a bit more advanced. If you want to see that one, you go take my intermediate macro class, Econ 303. That concludes our section on growth math. Now we're going to look at the main causes of growth. As we are well aware, GDP per capita around the world is not at all distributed equally. Some countries like the US are a lot richer than some others. So now we'll explore what causes that to be so. Our main causes are resources, technology, and institutions. Now, we're going to talk about these three factors for the rest of the semester. Make sure that's drilled into your long-run memory. Within that first category of resources, we're going to split it up into three subcategories. So, the first time I heard about resources, I probably thought natural resources. That's one kind. We're going to take a broader view of resources being basically factors in production. So it's going to include two other things as well. There's going to be physical capital and also human capital. We'll define both of those shortly. So, all else equal, we know that if a country has more resources, it should also have more real GDP per capita. That just makes sense. I have a short video illustrating the power of resources and economic growth. Let's go watch that one. Assuming the computer will let me. Okay, I'm not quite sure what's going on here. Computer does not want to follow the video. I'll just post the video separately when I put this up on Blackboard. So, all else equal, we do expect more resources to mean more real GDP per capita, more growth. The issue we face in the data is that this all else is usually not equal. Somewhat surprisingly, there's actually a pretty strong negative correlation between resources and real GDP per capita. So actually, we see a country with high natural resources, what it usually seems to go along with is a lower rather than higher real GDP per capita. That's really counterintuitive. It got this name, the resource puzzle, or in some other books, the resource curse. There are some encouraging examples that do verify our intuition. Countries like Norway, for example, they've got a lot of oil. They also have a really high real GDP per capita, so that makes sense. There's a lot of other exceptions that do not fit our intuition that we have to somehow explain using other factors. So I do think resources do matter. I don't think anyone's saying resources are bad for growth. It's just that they're often outweighed by other factors that are also very, very important. So that's our first kind of resource. There's natural resources. The second kind of resource is physical capital. So that includes things like the equipment used in production. So if your firms have a lot of machines in their factories, that's physical capital. It also applies to infrastructure. If a country has more roads and bridges, that can help the firms get their goods to market or help them export their goods. That's also beneficial for growth. As a result, there are lots of interventions out there trying to help poor countries accumulate more capital. They thought that if we only got them more capital, that would get them back on the path to growth and that would make them prosperous. To be clear, I'm not saying that capital is irrelevant. It does matter. Rather, if you're pursuing capital in isolation, you're neglecting other factors, the results might not be as good as you planned. So what has happened in some of these cases is they go and they build a bridge or something, they build something else in a poor country. 10 years later, it breaks, and none of the people there know how to fix it. Then they're just kind of back where they started. So don't focus too much on any one factor here. All these factors are important together to get economic growth. So thus far we have natural resources, we have physical capital. Our third kind of resource is human capital. So that refers to how many workers you have and also how skillful they are. So the better educated your workers are, the more they know, that's going to help them become more productive and help your economy grow. And that explains at least part of the wide variation that we see in real GDP per capita around the world. Some countries have a lot better education systems than other countries do. There is some kind of schooling just about everywhere, pretty much, but the quality can vary a lot. They might not get the same 12 years or K-12 like we get here in the U.S. everywhere. And also, people who've gone to school for several years in some countries might or might not have some basic skills like being able to read. So those differences in education are going to translate into differences in real GDP per capita when those students become workers. So, as before, don't focus too much on one factor and neglect the rest. Because of this, there's been a lot of charitable work in trying to improve education in poor countries. The problem that arises is that if you improve the school system without fixing the rest of the economy, those newly educated students end up moving somewhere else. That's called brain drain. I saw an article way back when I was an undergrad. I was taking Principles of Micro. I had to read this article on the final exam and write something about it. They were talking about the medical school system in Zimbabwe. As you probably saw back in Chapter 8, they had that picture of the Zimbabwean billionaire who is actually a beggar because they had some severe inflation problems. Even having $1 billion Zimbabwean dollars was not a whole lot of money. So these med schools in Zimbabwe were graduating students who knew their stuff, but they did not have a lot of economic opportunities. The article even said there are actually more Zimbabwean doctors in America than there are in Zimbabwe. They're actually losing a majority of their graduates to other countries. So that's not very good for the developing countries because they're paying this money to develop their school system, but the educated workers take their skills elsewhere. So schooling does matter, but if you fix that without fixing the rest of the economy, it's not going to work very well. So that's our first main factor in long-run growth. We had resources, which was divided into natural resources, physical capital, and human capital. Our second, those are minor categories. Our second major category is technology. The role of technology on growth is pretty self-evident. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about that. As one brief illustration, I want to point us back to a graph we saw in Chapter 7. This is from our unemployment chapter. It was showing that the U.S. economy has been trending away from agricultural jobs and also away from industry jobs and more towards services. So I'd like to highlight the role of technology in making this possible. While the share of workers on farms has plummeted, in that same time frame, we have not starved. How is that possible? Well, technology made our farmers much more efficient. As a result, with the same number of workers, you now produce a lot more food, so hiring a vast number of workers was no longer necessary. And that shift towards industry and service allowed a lot of economic growth to take place, radically transforming what economic life looks like in the U.S. Major factor number 3. So we had resources, we had technology. The last major factor is institutions. In general, it's just going to be a significant practice or relationship, organization in a society. Your book then breaks that down into 5 types of institutions. So it's hard to measure these things precisely. Like, what does it mean to have 0.8 units of property rights? Or what does it mean to have 0.5 units of political stability? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So what often happens is these researchers will try to develop some kind of index of institutional quality, and there is some subjectivity in there. However, in spite of different methodologies, they all get the same result, which is that higher quality institutions give you more real GDP and give you more growth. So institutions do clearly matter, even though it's tough to measure them. So let's go through each one of these in turn. Number 1, private property rights. Now, a big thing behind pretty much all these institutions is creating the right incentives for growth. You got to get people to work for there to be growth. You got to get people to be motivated to come up with new ideas and find ways to do things more efficiently if you're going to get growth. Now, we kind of have that framework we take that framework for granted in the U.S., but it's not universal throughout the world. Property rights are important for providing that motivation for growth. If you take away the property rights, then the incentive to work is going to largely go away. Why should I invest all this time and effort planting crops on a piece of land when someone else can just steal my property? Makes no sense. I get to do all the work, they get all the benefits, so I'm not going to do that. In some cases, property rights may be unclear. By that, your book gives an example. They talked about a country where land does get owned by someone, but the records keeping track of who owns what piece of land are not very well organized. As a result, there might be 3 different people or something like that who all claim the same piece of property. So you really want to be sure this property is mine, not someone else's. You might have to buy it 3 times to buy everyone else who has a claim of some sorts to that land. That's going to make it harder to acquire property and also create more uncertainty that if I do develop a property, what if someone else just takes it from me? So in a lot of models, there's an implicit assumption of property rights. Take that away, and the incentives for growth vanish. So these are really crucial in getting economic growth to happen. Of course, around the world across time, there have been a lot of communes that are basically trying to say there are no property rights. We all just work together and live together and provide for each other selflessly. Never works. It always breaks down. You really need property rights and incentives to get growth to happen. Institution number 2, political stability and rule of law. So the rule of law is closely related to property rights. It's not enough to have a piece of paper that says, I own this land. You also have to have a government that's willing to enforce that. That's the rule of law part. We also have to have an expectation that the government in the future will continue to respect those property rights. So if the current regime is establishing property rights, if there's a lot of political instability, if there are revolutions and civil wars, we might be uncertain that the next regime will respect our property rights. So if I go and work and plant my crops today, I got to be certain that when harvest time comes, I still have property rights to that land and to the fruits of my labor. For political stability, if there are violent revolutions that can destroy property as collateral damage, maybe your factory gets hit by a missile when they're trying to hit the other side, for example. If that's a big risk, then it's probably not a good idea to spend a lot of money developing your factory and working on it in the first place. You have to do all the work and pay all the money up front, but it might just get wiped away in a battle. Not worth it. Rule of law also refers to corruption. This can be a big problem in some parts of the world. So what corruption does that would discourage investment in our business and discourage our business from growing. If my firm gets larger, I might not get to enjoy the profits from it. Instead, it might just make me a bigger target for politicians trying to get bribes from me. So my incentives are to stay small. There is some research out there. I know someone who studied this. He found everything. Places with a lot of corruption, the firms would be very small or very large, but not a whole lot in between. The small firms would try to stay under the radar by being too small and noticed by the politicians and therefore not be targeted for lots of bribes. The large firms are the ones that are big enough and powerful enough to pay the big bribes and influence the politicians to bend the rules in their favor. Corruption can also misallocate resources across sectors. The folks in power might favor firms in one sector over firms in another sector, and that might not be the best way to allocate resources. Also, they might favor firms owned by family members or well-connected people over the less well-connected firms, even though the less well-connected ones might or might not be the better ones to be the more productive ones. This can be an issue because a lot of times economic growth comes from some small firm with a new idea that's going to disrupt the industry and throw out some of the bigger firms. So if you squash those small firms with innovation, that can really hurt you down the road when you're looking at long-term growth. Institution number 3, competitive and open markets. Competition provides incentives for growth in to make your products better. If you have a monopoly, that means by definition there's no one who's competing with you. So your incentives to make better products or finally make them cheaper or make a better deal for your consumers is not as strong. If you're in a very competitive market, it's quite different. If you just keep doing the same thing you've been doing, then one of your rivals might innovate and they're going to overtake you. And you're going to go out of business. So for competitive industries have a big incentive to keep trying to do things better and either keep up with their rivals or try to overtake their rivals. Unfortunately, in some poor countries, there are lots of large monopolies and even sometimes government-owned monopolies. So instead of fostering competition, the governments there are actually creating a lack of competition. The second part of this institution is open markets. By open, we mean open to trade and international investment. We already saw back in Chapter 2 that trade creates value, so I don't have to go over that a whole lot. We'll focus more on how trade, rather openness to international investment can help out the domestic firms. So if you have a closed economy, that is one with no trade or international investment, your firms have to rely upon domestic lenders in order to raise money for loans. If you open your country to international investment, now you have the extra option of borrowing from foreign firms, from foreign banks. That gives you more flexibility and more competition in lending, which can push down the interest rates your firms are paying. International trade can also strengthen the competition. That's why it's put together in the same category as competitive markets. So now instead of just competing with domestic firms, you're also competing with foreign firms, so if you have more people to try to stay ahead of and more pressure to innovate and do things better. So that's also important for long-run growth. Moving on, we'll look at institution number 4. That one is efficient taxes. This one's kind of a balancing act, you can think of it that way, for what the government has to do. On one hand, many of the things we said before that are important for growth don't come for free. We said that physical capital was important for growth. Need roads and bridges. That's going to cost money. We also said you need rule of law. You've got to pay your police officers and pay your judges. That's also not free. Schools contribute to human capital, your workers' skills. That's also not free. You have to have some level of taxation in place in order to provide these other factors that are important for growth. Now, what you got to balance that against is the fact that many of these taxes that raise money for these important things can also weaken the incentives for growth. There are lots of different kinds of taxes out there. I'll go through some of the most common kinds and see how they diminish the incentives to produce and to grow. Income taxes. The reason why I go to work is so I can earn money to buy stuff. If you have a bigger tax on income, that's going to mean you're going to have less money left over for consumption. That's going to weaken your incentive to go to work, have a job. On the other hand, the alternative to working, leisure time, is not taxed. So the more you tax income, you're going to see people work less, and they're going to be spending more time on leisure. That's going to diminish growth and real GDP. Sales taxes also weaken growth. That's because they also diminish the incentives to work. The reason why we work is so we get money to buy stuff, and with a sales tax, we can now buy fewer goods with our money than we could before. That's what we're going to pay. Notice the price of the good to the store, we're also paying a tax on top of that, so that's going to reduce the number of things I can afford. So as we're going to work less and substitute that with spending more time on leisure, diminishing our growth. You tax imports with a tariff or a duty. That's going to discourage international trade. We said trade creates value. And also can inspire the other countries to retaliate with tariffs on our goods. That's what's going on quite recently. I've been reading the news about what's called trade war. That means we put tariffs on them, they put tariffs on us, we put more tariffs on them, then they put more tariffs on us, etc., etc. When they retaliate with putting more tariffs on our goods, that's going to harm the American firms that are exporting. So it also harms economic growth. There's some other examples of taxes out there that I did not put in our slide, didn't have space for them. We talked about the capital gains tax back in our chapter on inflation. So remember how that worked was that if you buy a stock at one price and you sell it later for a profit, you pay the capital gains tax on that profit. If you were to raise the capital gains tax, that's going to discourage financial investment. People are going to buy fewer stocks, which will make it harder for firms to get loans, to get money for new projects and investment. That's going to harm growth. What people will start doing instead, if you have a bigger capital gains tax, is that they're going to start spending the money on consumption today. If you consume today, you avoid any capital gains tax. So just about all the common kinds of taxes discourage growth, but you need some taxes to pay for the things that are important for growth. So you got to find the right balance there. That's a very difficult and controversial question. People give you different answers on what the right balance is for what's the right amount of taxation and the right amount of these items that are important for growth. All right, institution number 5, stable money and prices. We're trying to avoid the big problems that arise with inflation and also with deflation. So I don't have to say a whole lot about that because we have a whole chapter on the cost of inflation. As we saw back there, inflation causes some very real problems in the economy, so you got to keep it under control if you want to get a good environment for economic growth. So that concludes our chapter 11. So we'll stop there and pick up again next time in chapter 12.